women-owned enterprises in terms of reserving public sector procurement for women-owned enterprises. So, basically the point is, in the first two sections of this, in domestic drivers, we have spoken about the importance of deregulation. We have spoken about the importance of continuing with various initiatives that we have looked at in the previous surveys in terms of boosting the productive potential. This is all from the policy space. From there, we move on to the role of the private sector, because naturally for a large economy, private sector plays a very big role. And in terms of the private sector, the specific asks are balanced deployment of capital and labor, curbing ultra-processed foods, fairer distribution of incomes, which is related to the balanced deployment of capital and labor, workplace, importance to workplace safety, workplace culture and mental health, and thinking about supply and sourcing from a strategic perspective as well. Investment in R&D. So these are all the dimensions in which the private sector can also raise the game for the new playing field that we are confronted with today. In terms of fairer distribution of incomes, a topic which we brought up last survey as well, if you look at the growth in profitability and the growth in employment expenses, which is a combination of hiring and compensation, there is a huge disparity between the two, which has been highlighted by several private sector players themselves in the last few months. And this happened even as Indian corporate sector profitability hit a 15-year high in March 2024. And some of you may have heard that when in the 1960s, when Henry Ford raised the minimum wages for his car workers, he said, otherwise there will not be enough people to buy the cars the Ford Motors produces. So in some sense, raising wage and salary growth for workers is also a source for aggregate demand for businesses in the medium run as well. So it is both, it is enlightened self-interest rather than being seen only from a moral prism as well. And in terms of balanced deployment of capital and labor, the clear example is the use of artificial intelligence, and we have a special essay on this topic. In chapter 13, in July 2024, we spoke about the energy demand management in a special essay on dealing with climate change. This time, the special essay is on the impact of artificial intelligence on employment generation and in general on labor. Deployment of artificial intelligence presents both opportunities and challenges. Past technology revolutions in general, sometimes we all feel that technology eventually generates more jobs than it displaces. That is true. But the key word is eventually. What happens between now and eventually is critical. And that is where I think we need to create supporting institutions, enabling institutions to train them, to prepare them, and academic curriculums have to change, workplace practices have to change, etc. So therefore, technological transitions have not been painless in the past, particularly during the previous three industrial revolutions in the Western world. And we need to learn from them, and that is what this chapter covers. And the private sector therefore needs to weigh the benefits of artificial intelligence against the social cost, which may be subterranean in nature and which may surface over a longer period, eventually affecting the environment that is necessary for running businesses smoothly. And therefore, the chapter argues for a careful deployment optimized over a long horizon. This will augment labor and will deliver broad-based social benefits. Of course, one of the considerations, if I may say in a lighter vein, when we wrote this chapter was whether the chapter would become outdated by the time it goes to print, given the kind of fast changes happening in the artificial intelligence space. But the issues that are discussed here is not with respect to the technological developments per se, but also whether the potential and the threat the technology poses for augmenting labor or displacing labor. Those issues are discussed in chapter 13. And where else a private sector can contribute? Compared to several countries, when it comes to R&D spend, 50% of it happens from the government and only 41% happens from business enterprises. Even higher education, academic institutions only contribute 9% compared to other countries. I think this is one area where I think the private sector and people like Mr. Naushad Forbes, etc., have actually written about it. The funding of R&D in India is predominantly from government entities, and it is not for lack of incentives. Specifically, box item 7 in chapter 7 covers the various incentives that the government of India offers in comparison to peer countries, and they are definitely comparable. And R&D in India is primarily driven by business enterprises in many other economies, and whatever R&D happens in the private sector in India is not only low, but is also sectorally concentrated, and that is one area of improvement. Ultra processed foods. It is a 2.5 lakh crore business built on hyper palatability of food items. Misleading advertisements, celebrity endorsements, and missing and obscure labeling on packages targeting consumer behavior. Ultra-processed foods are directly associated with exposure to cancer, respiratory, cardiovascular, and gastrointestinal health outcomes. And poor dietary intake, unfortunately, is also associated with adverse mental health, and most UPF brands target children and adolescents. Therefore, we need to arrive at a quick resolution on the issue pertaining to front of the pack labeling, which has been happening in fits and starts in this country. And this is not just purely about consumer information and fair disclosure. It has got long-term implications for realizing our demographic dividend and productivity of our youth. Because we initiated the coverage of mental health in a big way in the last survey, and we continue that in this survey as well, and you can find more of it in chapter 11. 4 particular variables have a big implication for mental health. Those who rarely use smartphones, those who are close to their friends and relatives, and those who basically have social connect and physical activity and who consume healthy foods, they have a very high mental score. But if your consumption of ultra-processed foods is frequent, and if your family closeness is not much, and nor do you have enough free time for yourself out in the open, and if you rarely exercise, then your mental well-being score is very low. It is not a theoretical construct, it is an empirical finding across the world, including in India. And lower mental health naturally has a direct correlation with the number of working days and overall productivity as well. So in general, workplace culture, private sector's attitude towards ultra-processed foods, prioritizing medium term over short term, all these considerations will eventually determine whether India's wanted demographic dividend actually materializes or not. And I think this is a very important issue, rather than apart from skilling and education, etc. This is not widely discussed, and we feel this is an important area where private sector can contribute a lot. Energy transition the Indian way, which is the topic in the chapter on climate change and adaptation. A well-known French economist, Jean Pisani-Ferry, in the context of Europe, wrote that there is an impossible trinity of net zero. That is, policy cannot be at the same time fiscally sustainable and the economy is competitive without giving up on net zero ambitions. And that is what we call it, the impossible trinity of net zero. On the right side, between fiscal sustainability, net zero goals, and competitiveness of the economy at any given point in time, only 2 are possible. If you want to pursue net zero and be competitive also in the global economic space, then there has to be a lot of subsidization that has to happen. If you want to be fiscally sustainable, on the other hand, and also be economically competitive, Europe is realizing that net zero goals will become that much more challenging to pursue. Again, the Mario Draghi report on competitiveness has a lot to say on this with respect to Europe, and it applies to developing countries like ours as well. At the same time, if you want to pursue net zero, at the same time be fiscally prudent, then competitiveness will take a big hit as well, because energy costs will go up significantly, as has happened in Europe between pre-COVID and post-COVID. So the net result is that the trade-offs in climate mitigation is such that these days countries are realizing that we need to spend a lot of effort and resources on adaptation. The theme of the chapter on climate this time is how do we maximize our adaptation efforts, adaptation funding, as opposed to focusing on emission mitigation. India's energy transition, therefore, needs to have a multifaceted approach. It cannot be only about renewable energy, and renewable should be expanded to include transition fuels like natural gas and also, more importantly, nuclear power as well. And coal will continue to remain the mainstay even as we are making far better progress than many other countries on nationally determined contributions. In fact, India's use of coal has not come in the way of India making much better progress on NDCs compared to Western nations. These considerations are discussed in great detail in the chapter on climate and also in chapter 5 as well. In terms of financing, much of the flows today are concentrated on emission mitigation. But critically important, given the fact that the greenhouse gases already in the atmosphere will anyway cause global warming and damage to countries' environment, countries need to generate more adaptation financing. In fact, Nobel laureate Thomas Schelling very clearly said, if per capita income growth in the next 40 years compares with the 40 years just before that, vulnerability to climate change should diminish and the resources available for adaptation should be greater. I say this not to minimize concern about climate change, but to anticipate whether developing countries should make sacrifices in their development to minimize the emission of gases that may change the climate to their disadvantage. Their best defense against climate change may be their own continued development. Basically, the point is, economic growth and development generates the resources to be able to deal with energy transition and climate change, and therefore, if we have to continue to grow while making energy transition, prioritization should be on adaptation. And apart from the strategic considerations I mentioned earlier in terms of ensuring that we are not affected by the single source concentration risk that many countries, including India, are exposed to. And as we wrote in the last economic survey in chapter 13, the power of collective action, small changes, big impact, has to be also kept in mind. The lifestyle for environment movement, small individual actions, impact of lifestyle changes, a 13% change in global population behavior can reduce carbon emissions. For example, having the thermostat at 26 degrees or 27 degrees and having a small fan circulation will keep the room cool than keeping the thermostat at 20 degrees in summer, for example. Food waste reduction. Finishing food on a plate can save 90 kilograms of food waste per person annually, cutting down carbon emission and food loss. Carpooling and public transportation, which I alluded to earlier, can cut down transport sector emissions. Carpooling can save 380 million liters of fuel daily in India by reducing nearly 8 lakh rides per day. And public transportation, in terms of integrated solutions, is much better than focusing on tailpipe emissions through e-mobility, which also has a strategic angle to it. Recycling power. Recycling 1 ton of newspaper can prevent 25,000 liters of water wastage, contributing to more efficient resource use. Finally, we come to the state of the economy, which is the current. The economy grew 6% in the first half, and second half it is poised to do better. Growth remains close to decadal averages, especially if you look at agricultural sector, gross value added, industry. They all have grown better than the average over the entire period between FY15 and FY24 in FY25. Services sector is almost there, but overall the point is that the pandemic effects have completely now been erased from the trend growth estimates. And you can see that in the different components of expenditure-based GDP. Gross fixed capital formation has improved from 28.2% to more than 30%. And consumption share, private consumption share has gone up from 58.7% to 61.8%. And government expenditure has come down, in fact, from 10.8 to 10.3% compared to FY18. And export share also has gone up from 18.8 in FY18 to an estimated 21.5% in FY25. So basically, compared to the pre-pandemic shares of GDP, there is a good contribution or a better contribution coming from exports and gross fixed capital formation. and private consumption as well. And this is what I mentioned in the previous slide. If you look at the overall GVA on the top left, it has caught up with the trend growth, pre-pandemic trend. Agriculture has been above pre-pandemic trend, partly because of the growth in allied services, which I showed you earlier, which is high single-digit growth rates. And industry has now just popped its head above the pre-pandemic trend, bottom left. And with respect to the overall services sector, again, we have caught up with the pre-pandemic trend as well. Inflationary pressures have come down, barring a few items. If you look at the left side, you see the core inflation, core food, consumer food price index, overall core inflation, and the CPI inflation. Core inflation is below 4%. Overall inflation is 5.2%, and the food price inflation index is close to about 8%. But if you remove specific items, then you can see that overall inflation trends are very subdued, and that is what the right side chart confirms for us. Headline inflation is 5%, but excluding tomatoes, onions, and potatoes is about 4%. Excluding pulse and vegetables is below 4% as well. In terms of export growth, while the headline numbers in merchandise exports may appear subdued, if you strip out petroleum and gems and jewelry, the growth is close to 10% between FY24 and FY25 in the first 8 months of the current financial year. And services sector in general have continued to grow in terms of the surpluses, and in the first half of the first 9 months of April to December 2023 and 2024, there has been a bigger surplus on the services trade as well. Naturally, all of this resulting in a balance of payments which is very comfortable. Around 1% of GDP is the current account deficit. And therefore, financing this current account deficit has been not a problem despite successful and profitable exits by many businesses in the last 2 years. Even as the gross inflows are improving, the repatriations on account of profitable exits or transfer of ownership from direct to portfolio investors hasn't posed a problem for the current account because of the subdued oil prices, strong private transfers, and good export performance in the services sector, contributing to a current account deficit which is just around 1% of GDP. The growth outlook for FY26, we projected 6.5% to 7% for FY25, and this time we are projecting a growth outlook between 6.3 and 6.8% for FY26, which is in line with the projections made by many international organizations as well. The risk factor, of course, again, not only because of the changes in the global playing field, global stock markets also have become lately volatile, as we witnessed earlier this week. And we have an interesting box item in chapter 2 looking at the correlation between S&P 500 and the Nifty indices. Whenever in the last 24 years, since the millennium began, whenever the S&P 500 corrected, what was the impact on Indian stocks and vice versa. So that is a factor that we need to keep in mind, because the massive growth in retail participation in the Indian stock market is definitely a good thing. But also, when the market corrects, it could have implications for spending intentions, and sentiment effect, etc. could be significant. And that is one risk we have kept in mind when we came up with the outlook between 6.3 and 6.8% for the real GDP growth. And as we always say, we will be very happy to be proven to be wrong and conservative if the final outcome turns out to be better than 6.8 as well. So, to sum up, how do we raise our game for a new playing field when globalization is no longer going to provide the tailwind in terms of export growth and foreign investment growth? We need to deregulate to make it easier for small and medium enterprises to grow. Deregulation is about removing the fear of growth in micro, medium, and small enterprises. And this is about the plumbing and the nuts and bolts of deregulation, which are primarily there in the state and local government space. We have to continue to augment internal capacities for growth. Particularly, agriculture sector has a potential to contribute up to 1% to GDP growth. Private sector can do its part in terms of lifting the spending on R&D, in terms of striking a better balance between capital and labor share in their businesses, in terms of marketing of ultra-processed foods and taking mental health seriously as well. With respect to energy transition, considerations of financing, considerations of supply chain concentration risk, etc. means that we need to focus on public transportation and adaptation as an important strategy rather than emission mitigation, in relatively speaking. Business as usual across all sectors, academia, private sector, governments, etc., business as usual carries the risk of growth stagnation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for the presentation. Now floor is open for the questions. So starting with 127. Please introduce yourself and your organization's name, and then mic at 127.
Hi, sir. Good evening. Hi, sir. Good evening. This is Ruchi Bhatia from Bloomberg News. This is Ruchi Bhatia from Bloomberg News. Your economic survey, sir, did make a case for deregulation and asking states to really get out of the way so that businesses can do better. I just want to understand from you, what can the federal government really do to nudge or prod states to get out of the way, to be able to deregulate in a more extensive way?
I think more than the federal government nudging them, the successes of states that have done deregulation more than others, which is what the chart on the progress in Business Reform Action Plan, BRAP, and level of industrial activity, that should in and of itself be a sufficient motivation.
4.
So Timsi Jaipuria, this side from CNBC TV 18. Sir, your survey did mention about employment. It also warned about AI taking away a lot of roles, but also said that employment at the level when it comes to the private sector, a lot of working hours need to be managed. At factory level also, working hours need to be regulated. There should be a flexible working hours to be given to the employees. What is it that the government has in its mind for the private sector on employment, be it generation of employment, be it the working hours, or as you made a case for salaries, wages to be enhanced? You gave a very clear example of Force Motor saying that if salaries increase, only then people can buy the cars that Force Motors is manufacturing. So given all of this, what is your view or what government can do on the employment side?
Again, what the government can do was already demonstrated in the July budget of last year, when the government announced multiple schemes to incentivize labor augmentation in businesses, both in manufacturing, non-manufacturing, new jobs, adding to existing payrolls, etc., by defraying some of the contributions to EPFO, announcing the corporate internship scheme. So what the government can or should do was extensively mentioned, and even policy actions taken in the last budget of July 2024. And of course the government can continue to take policy actions as it has been doing with respect to PLI schemes on labor-intensive sectors. And also in terms of the deregulation action, that is the government's, not just the union government, but the state governments and local governments' contribution to employment generation, is by reducing the fixed cost of doing business so that firms can raise the variable cost by hiring more people. Beyond that, I think not everything needs a policy tweak or a policy intervention. Some of it is in the natural self-interest of businesses to be able to find this balance. And that is why I gave the example of Mr. Henry Ford. I'll just ask my colleague, Anuradha, do you have anything to add? No. Okay.
2.
Dr. Nageswaran Karishma this side from Business Today. The previous economic survey had mentioned about the China Plus One strategy and how India could draw dual benefit out of it. But this one does not explicitly mention it. Does this indicate a change of stance of the government, or the strategy is still a part of it?
No, there is nothing. This time we are speaking about the importance of importance to be given to domestic growth drivers, building domestic supply chain resilience, which is the same as what has been the thought process behind the Atmanirbhar Bharata, China Plus One, etc. So this is the continuation of the same theme.
122.
सर मैं लक्ष्मण हूँ CNBC आवाज से। छोटे छोटे 2 सवाल हैं। एक तो आपने सर्वे में कहा है कि फैक्ट्री एक्ट को अमेंड करना चाहिए ओवर टाइम लिमिट को बढ़ाने के लिए। अभी 2 बड़े CEOs ने, एक ने 90 आवर पर वीक, एक ने 70 आवर पर वीक का सजेशन दिया है। आप इसको किस तरीके से देख रहे हैं? सेकेंड थिंग कि जो ट्रंप के आने के बाद एक टैरिफ का जो कंसर्न है, ये कितना बड़ा कंसर्न आपने फैक्टर इन किया अपने ग्रोथ आउटलुक में?
I don't want to go into the discussions that are currently happening in the private sector on the number of hours. So that is not something that we want to join. The point here is that small businesses do get seasonal surges in orders. And it will be good for them to have the flexibility to be able to achieve the weekly working hour limits over a longer period, which countries like Korea, Japan, etc. do that. So it is all about managing the seasonal surge in businesses. We are not going into the question of number of hours that Indians need to work, etc., which is a debate happening elsewhere. It is very difficult to give you a quantitative estimation with respect to the impact of trade policies that may be pursued by other countries, because right now it is hypothetical and speculative. But in general, what we have done is to take into consideration the uncertainties posed by the current global environment in terms of rising trade restrictions, rising investment restrictions, and therefore the growth number that we have spelt out does reflect these uncertainties, broadly speaking.
39.
So Meghna Mittal from Money Control. You have emphasized on the risks that are there because of increasing dependence on a single country for energy transition, whether it's EVs or solar energy. I want to understand, are there any policy initiatives that India can still take to boost domestic manufacturing, or have we missed the bus? What are your thoughts?
No. Actually, we have been taking those policies. That is why we have already built several elements of the solar energy supply chain in India. Capacities have increased, whether it is in panels or modules or cells, etc. But at the same time, dependence also is there at a significant level. So it is not as if India has been passive and idle and simply depending on imports, whether it is in electric vehicle mobility or the battery cell components or in the components that go into solar panels, etc. Domestic capacity increase is happening. But given the state of demand and given the projections for demand growth, dependence also will continue to be there, and therefore we need to, this is something that one cannot give a mechanical or a formulaic answer, but it is about the consciousness with which we basically adopt multiple approaches to handling this supply chain dependence for the foreseeable future. And one of the answers we gave was, therefore, public transportation, giving an important role for nuclear power, transition fuels, etc., are all parts of the strategy. I'll ask my colleague Chandani if she has anything more to add as well.
I think in addition to that, the government has also provided direct incentives for battery storage and also for electric vehicles manufacture. And On the issue of diversifying our sources of energy, there is a clear push by the government to diversify. So while we are doing renewable and non-fossil fuel, but there is a move, as was mentioned in the budget announcements last year, to also look at nuclear for small modular nuclear reactors. So there is a discussion and there is a push to become more and more energy secure for India's growth. Thank you.
26. From left side.
Sir, Rishabh Bhatnagar with NDTV Profit. My question is, in the Eco Survey, you've recommended private investments for small-scale farmers. What exactly does this entail? Is this privatizing parts of agriculture? And secondly, the Eco Survey also talks about... yes, page 249. And secondly, Eco Survey also talks about CBAM and EUDR as protectionist garbs. What exactly is India doing to sort of protest these on a diplomatic level?
So in agriculture, there is, if you go back to the economic survey, you would see how much has been the credit flow to the farmers, how much of that has increased. And there was also a slide here which said that it's actually enhanced substantially. Also, there is a shift away from money lenders, the traditional means of financing their investments, towards institutional lending. And that has, in fact, from 90% that used to actually go to money lenders for their resources, it's down to less than 30%, which is much less than 30%, which is an indication that the institutional investing through, and the farmers are accessing that. In addition, for working capital requirement, the Kisan Credit Scheme card, the Kisan credit cards have worked very well to enhance that the availability of financial resources for them to manage their working capital requirements. In the long run, the private sector, as in the corporate private sector, will also need to invest, because that is where the resources for capital investments will, that are required for agriculture will come in. On the issue of CBAM, so this is, CBAM is a border, it's a carbon border adjustment mechanism as it's called, and it's a levy that would face countries that have emissions in their products, embodied emissions, greater than a certain factor. It is in a way, it's a non-trade tariff measure. It's a non-tariff barrier, and it does not take into account the fact that countries like India, we are at a different level of development, so there is clearly, and we see this as a means to a protectionist means to protect the European industry, and more than just the stated goal of reducing carbon emissions, because the end result, and there are discussions on that, and there is that it would only shift the carbon emissions from, at the moment they are consuming, because they are basically importing much of steel, let's say, but by this measure they protect their own domestic industry, and the emissions will happen within their countries. So how much is going to be really stopped in terms of carbon emissions? There are a number of studies, and an UNCTAD report brings out the fact that there's not going to be much gained through that. So clearly a measure to protect their own industry. Thank you.
11.
Hello, sir. This is Surbhi from Business Today. Sir, the survey has spoken about the rupee and how the dollar has gained strength over the last few years, and the rupee has still performed well, depreciating 2.9%. So do you see further depreciation of the rupee? Because a lot of analysts are speaking about, rupee touching 87 or 89, and how do you see it impacting the economy? Thank you.
No, I think it's this foreign exchange management related question is better posed to the central bank, and unfortunately they're not here. I think the recent actions taken by the central bank, either with respect to the rupee or with respect to domestic liquidity, are the right steps in the right direction, and I don't want to add anything more than that.
46.
Sir, Prakash Pedashu from ET now. Boosting domestic consumption is of course a key focus for the government at this point of time. Did the economic survey make any specific recommendation to the government?
So what is the question?
The domestic consumption. I mean, boosting domestic consumption is of course a key focus for the government. So did the economic survey make any specific recommendation?
I'm not sure. The economic survey. I'm not sure, I really.
फिर से अपना क्वेश्चन दोहराइए प्लीज प्रकाश.
Has the economic survey made any specific recommendation to boost domestic consumption?
Yes.
Is that the question?
Yes.
Okay. Well, the recommendation which is made not just to the union government but to governments around the country is actually a step to boosting employment, income generation, and therefore consumption. This is about deregulation, is exactly towards that. It is not a recommendation only to the union government. So by simplifying regulations and by looking into the nuts and bolts of regulations that affect small businesses, we are lowering the cost of doing business for them, therefore opening up the space for them to hire more, which will lead to income growth and therefore better consumption. That is the very precise recommendation that the economic survey is making to governments all around the country.
52.
Good afternoon, Nikunj Johri from Reuters. So I have two questions. You've cited geopolitical risks to India's growth, and lately we've seen persistent tariff threats from the United States. So do you think India needs to have a preemptive policy, perhaps, or we need to our measures should be more reactive? And secondly. We've seen our net FDI is sharply coming down, although the gross FDI is increasing. There is a higher repatriation, as your presentation also stated. But the net FDI is sharply down. What do you think needs to be done to attract more FDI? The last year's survey suggested that India should open its door for Chinese investments. Lately, we've also seen de-escalation and resumption of direct flights. So do you think the time is right now to lift the investment restrictions that we have on China?
So Nikunj, with respect to your first question, the answer I gave to the gentleman from ET now is the same answer, which is that we don't want to talk about speculative scenarios of a single country's trade policies, etc. In general, I think the steps that we need to take, and in fact the economic survey, the chapter on external sector, has a box item on trade policies and the kind of industrial policies that have been adopted by countries in the past, and how we can adopt industrial policy without necessarily being protectionist about it. At the same time, it can also be an inducement for productivity. We have discussed all those things, and that is the way to approach it. So I think there is no point in being speculative, and whatever policies that may need to be taken in response to or in anticipation, that I'm sure ministries are looking at it. Now, with respect to boosting FDI, I think we have made our recommendations, a few suggestions in the last economic survey. But again, FDI is something, as we showed in one of the earlier slides, FDI as a share of GDP has come down much faster than the export share of GDP globally. And we are no longer competing only with other emerging market nations. We are even competing with industrialized countries which want to friendshore or onshore their investments. And therefore, so
one of the biggest magnets for FDI is actually the prospect of profitable returns, which is what India has been providing, whether it is portfolio investors or direct investors. And the last 2 years of continuous exits actually demonstrate that. And one way to ensure profitable exits is to ensure steady economic growth and wherever possible accelerating economic growth. Beyond that, whatever procedural requirements or opening up of sectors, we have done most of those things in several areas, more recently being in the last several years, being defense, space, drones, etc. So whether it is with respect to tariff policies or visa policies, etc., the government has been responding to the emerging situation, and therefore the FDI number should be looked at from the perspective of what is happening elsewhere in the world as well, in terms of overall FDI flows in general, which is what UNCTAD reports also point out, that there has been a decline because of various policy developments happening in every part of the world.
35.
Hello, Sir. Ruchika from Business Standard. My question is with regard to your comments on AI. You've said that private companies should take into account social costs when deploying AI. And the survey also says that if companies do not optimize the introduction of AI over a long horizon and handle it with sensitivity, there's the demand for policy intervention and the demand on fiscal resources to compensate will be irresistible. So is there a case of taxing companies if they replace labor with AI?
No, I'm not getting into specifics because we have not reached that point. It is a potential scenario that can develop if over time, and this is, by the way, a point made by the IMF in its discussion paper that came out roughly about a year ago, which is that if the social impacts of technological deployment results in such massive labor displacement, then in several countries, there will be a call for action on the part of the government authorities. But that is a hypothetical scenario which may develop if all considerations are not kept in mind, whether it is in terms of labor redeployment, labor reskilling, upskilling, etc. So this is, at the moment, there is no specific action that is contemplated, and that is not what is hinted at all in this special essay.
9.
सर तरुण शर्मा फ्रॉम जी बिजनेस। सर मेरे 2 सवाल हैं। पहला कि क्या अभी भी आपको लगता है जिस तरीके से फूड इन्फ्लेशन है वो एक मेजर कंसर्न है? आपने अपनी रिपोर्ट में कहा है कि जो फूड सब्सिडी है वो 0.5% से पिछले साल से बढ़ी है। दूसरा सर, क्रूड को लेकर आपका क्या आउटलुक है? क्या जो आपने 6.3, 6.8 का जो ग्रोथ रेट लिया है उसमें क्रूड का आउटलुक क्या रहेगा?
We have devoted a lot of space in the economic survey on food inflation. The point that we have made and we have been making over quite some time was that it's a concentrated impact of a couple of, or now let's say 3-4 items which lead to a very high food inflation. Food inflation is 8% now, and if we remove these 4-5 items, it becomes close to the target. So why does that happen is quite commonplace knowledge. It happens because when there are climatic disruptions which are increasing, which we have shown in the chapter, there are crop losses, and naturally that leads to a seasonal spike in food inflation. So it's a question of management of the season. It's not a perennial annual concern.
So we'll take last 2 questions. 121.
Okay. No, we don't make any assumptions on the crude oil price outlook. And we don't project inflation. Our projection is for real GDP growth. I think if at all you want to interpret the number, we are not expecting at this point a major upside risk to the crude oil prices. And that is not something we explicitly model or forecast when we develop an estimate for real GDP growth.
10.
Sorry.
इनको दीजिए 10 पे.
Siddharth from Informist.
हाँ, आपके बाद, इनके बाद आप लीजिए.
Just an extension to Tarun's question first. Last year, the survey had said that monetary policy should not focus too much on food inflation. Now this survey has spoken a lot more about expanding production output to lower prices, to ease supply. Does that reflect a change in thinking of you or the finance ministry in terms of how monetary policy should look at food inflation? And second, the survey has called for a tripartite compact between the government, private sector, and academics in distributing the gains from AI. From what you've seen in US, Europe, East Asia, the role of the government has mostly been about giving billions of dollars of subsidies. Is that what the Indian government's role too is expected to be when it comes to setting up, let's say, fabs and just generally in the AI sector? Thanks.
With respect to with respect to the role that monetary policy play on food inflation, etc., we have discussed it in the last survey. That issue was discussed and it is closed, and we are not making any observations on this at this point. Now, the comment about setting up fabs and etc., how does this relate to this question that you're talking about? I don't clearly understand the connection, inferences or the linkages you are making here. Yeah, right. Look, sure, I think all countries have to basically, there is no mechanical or formulaic way in which you can say that this is exactly the proportion by which you should mix technology and labor. It's an iterative process. We need both. You need to stay competitive, you need to provide gainful employment, and prepare the labor force to be productive as well, to be able to work with technology, etc. And in some cases where technology is useful in boosting productivity, it can also expand the business opportunities or the capacity, which can therefore, for example, if you're handling 10 queries today and if you're able to handle 1,000 queries with the help of technology, then the geographical coverage of your business can also expand, in which case you can absorb the labor by deploying them in more geographical areas. So the answers will therefore have to be found in specific situations.
10.
The government's role is in skilling, in making sure that there is the set of, which is exactly what we talked about in terms of the deregulation. The government's role is to reduce wherever possible. Again, I mean the government as in the government as a system, not just the union government. It is the union, state governments, local governments, in being able to reduce the cost of doing business otherwise, such that when the fixed costs go down, that is the government's role in making it easier for businesses to be able to hire labor, to retain them, to remove the fear of growth in micro, small and medium enterprises.
सर, मैं राजीव हूँ दैनिक जागरण से. मेरे दो सवाल है सर. पहला सवाल है कि करंट फाइनेंशियल ईयर में भी हमारा जो ग्रोथ रेट है वो 6.4 रहने का अनुमान है, और 25-26 में भी आपने 6.3 to 6.8% का अनुमान रखा है. तो क्या इससे हमारा जो विकसित भारत का लक्ष्य है 2047 में वो प्रभावित होगा, बिकॉज ये 7% से कम का ग्रोथ रेट है. नंबर 2, इकोनॉमिक सर्वे में कहा गया है कि चाइना पे जो हमारे सोलर एंड ईवी जैसे जो रिन्यूएबल एंड ईवी के लिए जो रॉ मटेरियल है, क्रिटिकल रॉ मटेरियल स्पेशली, उसके लिए हम चाइना पे सोलली डिपेंडेंट हैं और उससे बाहर निकलने की बात की गई है. तो क्या भारत को अमेरिका की तरह ईवी और सोलर रिन्यूएबल के प्रोग्राम को स्टॉप करना चाहिए या उसमें कटौती करनी चाहिए, बिकॉज हमारे पास रॉ मटेरियल है नहीं, और कहाँ अल्टरनेट है?
So on the first question, if you look at a global real economic activity index, it's available publicly. You just have to search on the internet for global real economic activity index. It is maintained by the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. It has been declining since 2023 and it has now come to negative territory. It is their index of global real economic activity. So the growth rate, after having achieved 9.7, 7 and 8.2, the current relative slowdown in the economy is to be seen in that context. And India still remains the largest growing economy, fastest growing economy among large economies in the world. And you saw also in the slides that the global export share of GDP has been coming down, etc. So whenever we get the opportunistically, if we can generate higher export growth as we were able to do so in 21-22, we should be able to capitalize on that, and that is what is happening as well. If you look at the kind of articles that we have written in the last 1 year, we have written about how India has been able to diversify its product areas and also open new geographies for our export products. Those are all the ways to go, and whenever the global export growth picks up, in those years, export growth will contribute another 0.5 to 1%. Additional growth, which will take it to 7.5 or 8. And as we also mentioned in the presentation, agriculture sector itself can add 0.5 to 1% of additional GDP growth. So in general, these are all the ways in which we can lift this baseline number, and this baseline number reflects the current uncertainties and the fact that global real economic activity has slowed down in the last 1.5 years to 2 years. So that is the answer to your first question. Now, the dependence on a single country is, as I mentioned repeatedly in my presentation, figures in the discourse, in the policy discourse in Europe. It figures in the policy discourse in North America, etc. It is a global challenge, and that is why India became part of the, my colleague Chandani will supplement what I say. That is why we joined the Critical Minerals Partnership, and we ourselves are have set up policies on, as she explained in the previous question, on battery storage and some of the PLI schemes on the components for solar energy, etc. So we are taking policy steps already, and we are striking global alliances to make sure that our supply chain is diversified. But simultaneously, we have to keep an eye on what is the level of dependence and how critical it is, how constraining it is. So it is a multifaceted, multi-pronged action which we have already been taking. So, Chandani, you want to add something? Viksit Bharat growth rate in respect of the nominal GDP growth in dollar terms that is required is around 10%. And I think it is not something that is achieved on an average, on a year after year after year. There will be years when we will achieve more than that, and there will be years when we will achieve lower than that, depending on the global scenarios. So it is not something that is a mechanical number that is applied exactly identically year after year. Global conditions will influence it in some years positively, in some years negatively, and we have to be prepared to take advantage of it in those conducive years, while maintaining a certain minimum level of growth in those years when conditions are not favorable.
Okay, sir. Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right, that was Dr. V. Anant Nageswaran, India's Chief Economic Advisor, was briefing on key narratives of the Economic Survey 2024-25, and that was live from New Delhi. Now, to discuss more on this, I've been joined by my colleague Mark Lin. He is there in the studio. Hi, Mark. I very much understand that the fact that this is your favorite subject and you can go on and on and on. But for our viewers, first things first, Mark, just tell us what is the purpose of Economic Survey?
Well, we need to understand that the budget session consists of three important parts to start with. First is the President's address, which happened today, where the government talks about its plans and also its achievements. So we get an idea of what this government has done, this dispensation has done in the previous year. It's the first statement that the government makes at the beginning of each year. Now that is backed also by the Economic Survey, which is like a photograph of the economy, the state of the economy as it stands, and puts it into context and background, because what we are expecting tomorrow is a budget which should relate to some of the ideas that are defined in the Economic Survey. So it gives us a hint of what we can expect in the budget, because the economy is, as per the Economic Survey, in good hands. You know, the balance of payment situation is stable. The economy growth rate the momentum is there. He talked about some deregulation and things like that. So if you have to look through this in some detail, perhaps we can see that whatever suggestions have been given in this Economic Survey might find resonance in the budget tomorrow. So that is the way in which one should look at it.
Okay, and very quickly, Mark, how do you analyze the economic survey?
Well, this is a rather long document. 480 pages is what it is.
Indeed.
And the chief economic advisor, he started by talking about, the 1980s right up to now, which is the era of globalization. And he said that era is now coming to an end. So, of course, there's a lot of things have happened in that era because India and China, the two large countries of the world in terms of population, were able to bring their poverty levels down. And that has significantly helped, in boosting the change of disparity equation in the entire world. But apart from that, he has talked about being too much dependent on one or two countries in terms of our goals, in terms of renewable energy and things like that. And he's talked about diversifying as a result of that. He's talked about deregulation being a pathway to increasing manufacturing because we need to increase the manufacturing sector in our country. That's one area that needs to contribute more. And he also talks about deregulation in the sense he talks about deregulation as the government moving out in a way and allowing businesses to operate on their own, to be able to hire labor and sustain that labor and to grow. But to provide that kind of enabling environment.
Indeed, Mark. We'll continue this conversation. All right, let's go across live now to New Delhi for the economic survey report.
Indeed, so this is a photograph, I suppose, of the family photograph, all those who contributed to this document. It takes a lot of time to make. He did say that the last one was presented in June, so it's really had only half a year to look at in terms of what it has surveyed. But all these people would have obviously participated in creating this document. And, academicians look at it in great detail because it's really what gives them their ideas about how to analyze the Indian economy, because this is a survey that is an authenticated survey that tells you what the real state of the Indian economy is. And it also gives you ideas as to how the economy is being influenced, how policy is being influenced, where the economy is going, certain concerns about challenges that are coming in from the external sectors. He talked about all these things, and it gives you a clearer idea as to where India stands in terms of its economy, and that's why this document is important.
Definitely, Mark. And also there was a hypothetical situation, wherein the chief economic advisor also commented that in future regarding the jobs that AI might take over. How do you analyze that? What are your views on that?
So clearly, technology is a very big, it's not only a disruptor, it's an enabler in the world. So we are seeing that a lot of the growth that is taking place is enabled by technology. It's happened from we are already in the fourth industrial revolution, which is a technology revolution, led revolution, and AI is at the beginning of taking that to the next level. So it is still unclear, as what the chief economic advisor says. The social impacts of artificial intelligence is still unclear as to how it can bring about labor displacement. But if that does happen, then policy will kick in. That's what other surveys have said, even the IMF and all that. Only when that happens, that's when you have to take decisions on how to react. Right now, that hasn't happened. Right now, in fact, perhaps it is helping labor to sort of increase its productivity because it's something that is an aid rather than a disruptor or a displacer of labor as things stand.
Okay, and also, Mark, we have to put in consideration the fact that industrial sector is also estimated to grow about like 6.2% maybe. So what's going to be the impact of that?
So indeed, our growth rate is going to be, as he said, for the first half of this year, the GDP growth has happened to be 6%, he says, and it would be about, the overall year would see about 6.8%. So he thinks that in H2 we are going to grow much faster. And of course, India is largely driven by services growth. That's a sector that is where we are strong at. And in services, we are much stronger in the IT space and the software services space. But really speaking, if we are to be, the third largest economy in the world, which is the path which we are taking, then we need to reach there through manufacturing. And hence he's talked about deregulation in terms to help bring people, the MSME sector to improve. There has to be this is not like the government should not be micromanaging all this. That's the kind of words he used. There is no need to micromanage even the education sector, because that's where your labor comes from. Allow these areas to develop on their own in that sense, and that will bring about the right kind of skill sets for people. It will be a demand-supply kind of an equation that will support this kind of industry. It just needs a little bit of a push. Policy needs to push things in that direction. Deregulation is rather the main word that he kept bringing up in this talk.
Correct. Mark, like I mentioned also in the beginning of our conversation that this is your favorite subject, and we can go on and on this. Tell us something, Mark. Which sectors are expected to drive economic growth in the upcoming year, according to you?
Well, he did say that agriculture, which is continues to be the largest employer in our country, that is a sector that can increase its share in the GDP. And there he's talked about bringing in certain reforms, and one of them is micro irrigation. If we are able to bring in a system where the irrigation costs are also not that high, and new methods of irrigation, and all these other schemes of the government which have helped in the distribution of of sanitation, of even finance to the rural areas. This distribution, bringing down the costs of distribution, all this has helped also this sector to grow. And clearly this is a sector that can contribute at least 1 to 2% more in GDP if it is given its opportunity. Then he talked about infrastructure also, and how it's going to continue to have a significant bearing, because as the economy grows, the infrastructure on which it stands has to continue to grow and become stronger. And here he's been looking at more or less the role of the private sector increasing. That has been for some time, and we are already beginning to see that the private sector has taken over many large infrastructure projects in our country. So infrastructure is also leading to higher production across the board, across all sectors, because goods and services are moving much faster through the economy. That leads to a sort of a multiplier effect. That's what the multiplier is, and it will help to increase productivity. Also, he talked about irrigation and health programs. They have helped in improving the productivity of ordinary citizens in our country, and these things are not quantified too easily, but we can see that when the productivity of a healthy person can contribute a lot more, right?
Yeah.
And obviously, so health programs that the government has put into place across the country have helped in improving the health of the people, as well as when we have taken water to the far-flung areas, that has helped irrigation, and the food production has increased. Hence, these are the primary areas which is on which every economy stands, on what is the primary sector. After that, the secondary sectors stand. So if we keep our primary sector strong, which has always been the focus of, political focus also of any government, because really at the end of the day, we depend on our farmers, and that is a sector that perhaps will require a lot more focus. But then he also talked about a certain problem that we might face, that is with regard to net zero, and the claims of net zero can put pressure on manufacturing, because it will take you away from competitiveness, because other places, other people are don't have these targets of net zero, and hence they are progressing at a faster pace. So he suggests that many countries who are in our place, or in the developing nation space, would be looking, the best way perhaps to cut costs to reach net zero is not really to look for the finance gaps from the advanced countries and all that. Is just to develop on your own, and as you develop, you automatically get these benefits of your own, and you can reach net zero. That is what, because it shouldn't come at the cost of your competitiveness.
Correct. All right, Mark, thank you so much. It was wonderful analysis by you, and thank you so much for joining in the studio.
You're welcome.
And that's all for this edition of DD India News Hour. But let us know your thoughts on the news of the day. For those on the go, you can get all the latest news and updates from India and across the world on DD India mobile app. The app, of course, is available on both Android and iOS platforms. That's it in this broadcast. Thank you so much. Stay tuned to DD India.
झूलता उछलता है, दौड़ता कभी कभी दौड़ कर आता है, आगे आगे बढ़ता है इंडिया, अमूल दूध पीता है इंडिया।
अरे वाह, लेजेंड की बैट, इससे तो मैं खेलूंगा। फ्यूचर बैटिंग लेजेंड है।
इसमें जिसका नाम लिखा है बैट